Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar for Future Strategic Directions for the UCGIS Launching the Conversation. I'm Harvey Miller. I'm currently president of the UCGIS. I'm joined by the president-elect, Jeff Hammerlink, and also our executive director, Amy Rock. So this is the start of a conversation that we're going to begin this year and carry through the remainder of my term as president and also next year as in Jeffrey's term as president. And this comes from some conversations we had in the fall, but also dovetails nicely with one of Jeff's strategic initiatives he wanted to conduct during his tenure as president. So we'll start off in just a minute with a slideshow where we'll talk about the context, what we're doing, and how we want to do it. And then we want to turn it over to you, the audience, for a conversation. Amy, do you want to mention any logistical details or anything they need to know before we get started?
Sure, yeah. Even though we're in a sort of a conventional webinar template, we have enabled the chat, so you can ask questions in the chat or make comments. And then if you want to speak, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll allow you to speak. I'll allow you to speak. That sounds very magnanimous, doesn't it? I'll enable your talk feature, and you can be on camera or not, your choice. But we'll go from there. So we'll not use the Q&A. We'll just use the chat, and I'll try to keep up and pass questions to the presenters. Okay.
Okay, excellent. So now I'd like to turn it over to our president-elect, Jeffrey Hammerlink, who will kick us off.
Great, thanks, Harvey. Great to have folks tuning in today and joining as a part of this conversation that we are in fact launching today, thinking about future directions for our organization. I'll do a sound check and make sure everybody's seeing the slides as well here. So sound okay? Everybody's hearing me? Great. And seeing the slides in the presentation mode, hopefully. Excellent. Okay. Yeah. So our goal today in the next 45 minutes or so is what we really want to do is kind of set the stage for a new strategic planning effort for the University Consortium for Geographic Information Science, our organization, right? And I know we have some friends joining from other groups as well, and we're excited to have partners listening in as well. So in order to do that, you always have to start somewhere, right? And so kind of the things that we want to cover today is just a little bit of background on how we've done this in the past, our motivation for why we're doing it again now. Maybe get you all thinking about some of the different ways that we can go about doing this. We're not inventing strategic planning here. There's many that have come before us, and there are a lot of different ways to go about doing strategic planning. And we can sample from some or all of those and kind of come up with the best process that works for us. And then talk a little bit about timeline and process actually, and then get to some next steps and hopefully have some time at the end for input from you all. The first of many opportunities we're hoping for input. So it was kind of interesting. Amy shared a folder that had been curated about past strategic planning efforts in the organization. And so it was kind of fun to go back and look at that over the last 30 years. And so this is my best interpretation of this, but maybe there are others that are online that know better. But as near as I can tell, our first strategic plan was adopted at the Park City meeting in 1998. And looking back, I think I had a hand in that actually. Babs Buttonfield led it, and Jerry Dobson, I think one of our fellows, and there were a few other folks that helped put that together. But so that was kind of the first. And then we came along with a 5-year revision of that. That specifically called out this idea of annual updates, that's very aspirational, right? But sometimes not always possible. But it was in there. And so we've sort of had that at one point in our organization of the importance of keeping these things up to date. In 2011, I know there was a retreat I wasn't a part of, but I think it was out on Catalina Island, And there was a Catalina retreat, and that also led to a new plan in 2011. A few years later, there's a folder that talks about a 360-degree review. 360-degree reviews are oftentimes used for people, not organizations, but in this case, there was an attempt to do that. Although I had a hard time finding the end products of some of that, and so I need to do a little bit more digging on what came out of that. And then more recently, we had a town hall event at the 2019 symposium. And then kind of in the midst of all the craziness with, the global pandemic, there were discussions that happened, virtually. And then I think also in Syracuse a little bit in 21 and 22. So it's always been a part of our culture. And so we're kind of here revisiting it again. And so the motivation for our current effort is, it's time. We would benefit from an up-to-date strategic plan, and so we have that, and have Harvey's vision and thinking to really thank for jumpstarting this past fall with the Climate Smart Task Force that he led, which he's going to talk about here in just about 30 seconds, and also kind of along the timing being right, doing some futures thinking. As we approach kind of the milestone of our 30th anniversary next year. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Harvey to talk a little bit about the Climate Smart Task Force and where that's kind of led into our efforts today.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Yes, I'd like to report out from a group of a series of activities we had in the fall and winter surrounding this question of how do we become a more climate smart organization. Next slide, please. So these are the wonderful and very lively and intelligent people who joined me in this conversation. Patricia Cabellas Dale, Somier Dodge, Jeff Hammerlink, Amy Rock, and Shilung Shaw. These are people, representing the board of directors, the president-elect, past president and current president, and of course, our hardworking executive director. And we had a series of discussions over the fall semester and leading into winter, and they were very free-range discussions surrounding the basic question. Next slide, please, I should say. Next slide is, how do we move forward in a climate emergency? I don't think anyone on this call would debate that we are in a climate emergency, but we also need to continue to grow the organization, grow the participation, grow the penetration into our campuses to bring more people into our fold. So we've been doing this fairly well for 30 years, but now, as Jeff mentioned, we really need to start thinking strategically about what is going to be the next 30 years of this organization. But at the same time, any organization, our organization especially, because we're involved in GI science, geography, we supposedly care about the earth, at least we study it, we really need to be an exemplar of how an organization can move forward, increase its activities, growth, its penetration, and still decouple this from its climate impacts. So the main questions I raised to the group is, how should the UCGIS live up to its responsibility to both GI science and the earth? How do we expand and elevate UCGIS participation activities while lowering our impact on climate heating? How should we help universities and stakeholders respond to the climate crisis, even beyond just facilitating GI science on campus, but thinking about how GIS can be used and GI science can be used to help universities become more climate smart, more climate resilient, and help mitigate the climate emergency? And again, how can we be an exemplar of a climate smart professional organization? If any organization is going to be climate smart, it should be an organization that cares about the earth. Next slide. So we had, again, a series of discussions. I really want to thank the people I put together for this task force. Were all fantastic, very lively discussions, very free-ranging. Thinking went outside the box, as they say, immediately in these conversations, and people were really blue skying a lot of really creative ideas. I'm going to try now just to summarize some of the major outcomes of this discussion. One is that we talked about what is the audience for expanding the UCGIS, and we've already made some initiatives along these lines with respect to community colleges, but as I've said, I don't think we have enough penetration into our campuses. I think there are other people besides, I hate to say this word, but the usual suspects from each campus who come to the symposium and participate in the organization. There are other people, geospatial librarians, people doing GIS support, instructors, other people who are involved in the GIS infrastructure on campus that are not coming to the table. And that's not uniformly true, obviously not. We have geospatial librarian on our board until recently, and but just trying to ramp that up. What can we UCGIS do to make campuses better, not only in terms of GI science infrastructure, research, and teaching? I would argue that all these years into the so-called GIS revolution, universities still struggle to support GIS on campus. We're still have this attitude where GIS is just another software. It's like Microsoft Word or Teams. Just pay the license and let people use it. But I also feel that, again, given the responsibility of our organization and our domain and what we're claiming to be in the world, that we should be helping universities be better at climate adaptation and mitigation. Um, a question that came up, if we're talking about our climate impacts and our climate footprint, should we have an in-person symposium every year? No one likes pure virtual symposium. It's just not attractive, just sitting in front of your computer for 2 days in a row. I know I don't find that very attractive or useful, although remote talks and webinars like this activity do have their place. Different models came up, like a hybrid model, local on-campus events combined with online keynotes and other activities. An example I gave during this discussion is during COVID, we had the so-called 3C GIS Day in Ohio, where Case Western, Ohio State University, and University of Cincinnati had hybrid events with local in-person activities and shared keynotes and workshops and discussions, online. When we do in-person meetings, and I don't think anybody wants to completely abandon in-person meetings, what can we do to do active mitigation offsets and consider our, to offset the carbon cost of travel and gathering, but also should we consider climate footprints in meeting proposals? Next slide, please, Jeff. Again, immediately this wonderful group pushed me outside of my practical box, which I'm a very practical person, if you know me, into thinking outside the box. Should we be co-meeting with other organizations when we do meet in person? I think this year's model of meeting with CAGIS is actually working out very, very well. So far, the planning process has been very smooth and collaborative, and no one organization pushing their agenda on the other one. This is something we may continue, at least in an informal basis, when we do meet in person. And as you may know, CAGIS meets every other year. Or people brought up quicker than I thought that kind of surprised me, but people said, well, maybe we should be merging with some other organizations. That's a very interesting proposal. Maybe there is some value in consolidation. The problem, a potential barrier is that we have a unique membership model where individuals don't join, but universities join, and that doesn't really match with some other organizations. So we'd have to think carefully about that. We also, and this segues a little bit in next two bullets, segues into Jeff's initiative, information gathering. We need to start talking to our members and listening and figuring out what do they want, what do the members of this organization and the active participants, what do they want out of the UCGIS, and what are other organizations doing. AGU is an example of an organization that's taken a much more active approach to mitigating the climate impact of their meetings. And finally, what are the objectives? Okay, so if we're going to talk about how do we grow and decouple it from our climate impacts, that immediately raised the question, what is the point of the UCGIS? And maybe we need to rethink that. And only by knowing really or having a good sense of what people want out of the UCGIS and what our strategic goals and plans are, can we then talk about, well, how do we do that while minimizing our climate footprint? And this segues really well into Jeff Hammerlink being elected president starting next year, because this is an initiative he raised with us immediately. I'd like to go through a strategic planning process for the organization. It's been a while since we've done it, and therefore this is something that needs to be refreshed, especially at this time when we're approaching our second 30 years. So that's the segue. I plan to support Jeff in this initiative. the remainder of my term up until the meeting in June in Columbus, and then work on him with this as he assumes the presidency of the organization. Now, this conversation will continue in Columbus. We're going to have a panel on climate smart growth for organizations. This won't be specific to the UCGIS. We're going to have a cross-fertilization idea session about what other organizations that are doing, such as the International Cartographic Association, the UCGIS, and the World Geographic Information Council, and hear some of their ideas for moving forward in a climate emergency. Okay, that's it for me. Now I'll turn it back to our president-elect, Jeff Hammerling.
Thanks, Harvey. That was great, and really looking forward to continuing the discussion around how we respond to the climate crisis when we're in Columbus. That'll be great. So as we start to talk about strategic planning, and we've all been involved in these before, right? But it's sometimes good to pause and think about this a little bit more deliberately as we re-engage in a new strategic planning process that may or may not be similar or maybe different, from what we've done in the past. And so, just to kind of get folks thinking a little bit about, what really are some of those benefits of doing planning. And this is a really nice set of points that comes from I think it's the Association for Management, AMRMS. It's not coming to me, but I like the way they've kind of laid this out. Really starting with helping define a clear direction and focus for our organization. And that really begins with defining issues to be addressed. And so as Harvey alluded to, we want to be doing a lot of listening to begin with, and really making sure that we don't miss anything in terms of issues that either need to be addressed or maybe we want to address in more of a strategic way. Being able to align our goals with the resources that we have and the activities that we identify, and how we go about making decisions as an organization. Resources are finite, right? And so we have to be deliberate in terms of how we think about, where we put our energy and our fiscal resources, as well as time. I think that goes hand in hand with goal alignment, goes hand in hand with prioritization. This is one thing in the way, and I think we talked about this a little bit in the climate task force. Just sort of the cycle of leadership, right? Like people are on the board for, is it 3 years or something like that? And, the officers, president, your president-elect, and then your president, and then your past president. And, sometimes it takes a year in a new role just to kind of get up to speed. And so, being able to be cognizant of that and having that kind of align with how we prioritize the things that we're going to work on. I won't talk about all of these specifically, but just to mention, another example recently, being flexible and being able to adapt to changing circumstances. Like everything else, we went through that with the global pandemic. And so being able to use tools like a strategic plan to be able to be nimble in the way that we respond to those kinds of things. A plan as a tool for communication, both to our members, but also to our partners externally, I think is an important thing. So these are some of the reasons, right? And I think folks, we could come up with others, but maybe kind of a good capsulation of that. And so if we think a little bit about, what kind of strategic plan do we need, or what kind of strategic plan do we want? And I also like this, that I found an example online of, is that, in the end, it isn't one size fits all, right? And so you may end up in a plan revision or a new plan creation, focusing on a particular type of plan. And that's kind of maybe determined by some of the drivers that might steer us toward the particular plan that's best for us right now in this situation, you know. And so the standard strategic plan, right, where conditions are relatively calm. That's really the case for any organization, um, but 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 those conditions do exist sometimes. Perhaps we need to be more issue-based if we're facing a turbulent internal or management condition. We don't have that in our organization right now, I don't believe, but you know, about a decade or a little bit more, we did. We faced a tough time with some internal stuff that we had to work through, and we were able to do that. Organic strategic planning, responding to a troublesome external climate. Again, COVID is a great example of that. And kind of the same thing with being able to have a plan that's very real time and responding to things that are changing dynamically. So at any rate, I think the point here is that we should be thinking about, you know, that plans can look different depending on, you know, the state of the times, right? Maybe another way to also be thinking about this is, you know, there's some very traditional ways of carrying out a strategic planning process, you know, of starting with missions and visions and coming up with SMART goals and objectives and so forth, and which are very sort of operational in their orientation. And that's okay, and we may choose to sort of go that way, but maybe we mix it up a little bit with sort of a different way of thinking, and that's what's represented by the pyramid on the left here. And at the top of that pyramid is really they make, you know, the point is made in this model of really kind of doing a deep dive on the culture of the organization, right? And how we view ourselves as a discipline, how we view ourselves as an organization that supports that discipline, and how we want that culture to continue and evolve into the future in face of, you know, things that are happening in our affinity groups and other professional organizations and universities and other parts of the ecosystem as well. And so we may choose to really do a focus on this kind of aspirational culture that we have, and then build from there through the different stages that you see lined out here. Speaking of external forces, you know, there are different ways that we can do this. We might take a scenario planning approach where we actually sort of identify a handful of, you know, potential futures for the organization and sort of play out what that actually looks like. Sometimes people combine this with, here's, you know, more acronyms, but, you know, the steeple or the pestle sort of viewpoint. The diagram here is just a generic example of the pestle sort of framework. But the idea here is to try to look at these things in different categories of external forces and how they might impact how we plan for our organization. And so, you know, if you look on the far right, there's the environmental factors, right? And so we're having a deliberate conversation about how the organization moves forward with the existential crisis of climate change, you know, and so that's a piece of this. And so we can organize our process in this way as well. Another way that we would sort of look at this, and this comes out of Jeffrey Bueller's Change Leadership in Higher Education, which is this person has written a lot, and this is I like this book, and he talks about developing a strategic compass for an organization, and he really takes this idea from for those of you that have heard Jim Collins and a book that he wrote probably about 20 years ago called Good to Great, which is very much about the private sector and how you sort of take your organization to the next level. But he also wrote a tiny little monograph, which is about 30 pages long. And it's called Good to Great and the Social Sectors. And as you see on the top of the screen capture of the book there, it's like why business thinking isn't the answer, why it isn't always about that single bottom line when you're in a nonprofit or in the social sectors. And it's a great little monograph that kind of talks about, and of course, these are the businessy, jargony sorts of things, but he talks about the hedgehog concept, and he talks about, what as a group, what as an organization are we most passionate about? What can we be the best in the world at? Like for UCGIS, what are we the leaders on? What do people come to us for? What is our credibility centered around? And then taking those two things and thinking about what drives our economic engine. And we often don't like to think about that, but that does come down to things like membership models and dues models and putting together an annual budget and those kinds of things. And he pairs that with this idea of the flywheel. And that in the diagram on the left there, where you see the horizontal line, and then you see that inflection point, right? And this is the inflection point of going from good to great, if you will. But if you sort of plug in these the answers and our responses to these questions on the right, you start to get people on board and recognizing the work that you're doing and the benefit and value that you're contributing not only to our members, but also to larger society. And from that, it's just kind of a self-perpetuating sort of a thing. And so it's a simple model. It's a jargony kind of model, but it's one that I've used in past planning processes that if nothing else, helps folks think about, what they really want to be and what are the key things that they want to contribute. And so as we move forward with this, it's important that we recognize, sort of putting some sideboards on what we're able to do, right? And that kind of revolves around these points that I've listed here, I think. The diagram on the left is sort of how organizations actually form and get work done. So if you've heard the forming, storming, and norming sort of way of doing things, that dynamic plays out time and time again, I think, and I would expect it will in this case too. And so, things we talk about today may not be very well defined and kind of messy, and they may continue to be that way over the next few months. But then slowly we sort of kind of hone in and normalize the work that we're doing. But I think we also have to recognize that, we have limited bandwidth, right? We're a volunteer organization. We have Amy, but we don't have all of Amy, right? and she's probably a part of the 200% club, like a lot of us are. But we should all be aspiring to a better work-life balance, right? And so recognizing that, we have to be able to define what the capacity is for the board, for our leadership, for committees to be able to do this. I also want to think about timeline. It'd be great to get this done in 12 months, right? And is that the goal that we want to have? The third thing is how we want to engage, both with our membership and external partners. And then what do the end products look like? Is this a document? Is this a one-pager? And so I think these are things that we also want to think about as we move forward. To that last point, I just thought maybe a visual comparison here. So on the left is just a screen capture of page 1 of the original UCGIS strategic plan from 1998. This is a Word document that I found somewhere. It's 14 pages long. It's a good read. And it's actually interesting to go back and kind of look at it. Conversely, on the other side, this is an organization that maybe shares some similarity to ours. It's called the Computing Research Association. And these are kind of like schools of applied computing across North America. And a colleague of mine recently attended their meeting, I think it was last week in Chicago. And so I was curious about the organization, and I went online and I found their strategic plan, and it's 1 page. So here's the Computer Research Association strategic plan for the next 5 years. And it's centered around 6 strategic themes, and you can see them there with the little icons. So, 2 very sort of different approaches, almost 20 years apart. And so as we kind of close here, just with the comments, some of the initial steps that we're talking about. One is to be on the watch for an invitation to participate in an online survey, just around planning topics, like what kind of issues and topics would you like to see addressed? At the upcoming CAGIS plus UCGIS event, Harvey already mentioned the panel on climate smart growth for organizations. There'll also be an interactive session that I'll be leading around just kind of looking at the whole ecosystem for geospatial and higher ed. And then this might not even be on the website, so it may be word of mouth more than anything else. But for those that are still around on Thursday, maybe either participating in a workshop or have a later flight, say at noon or in the afternoon, we're looking at creating a space to have a listening session on Thursday morning as well. And then from that, I think we'll be looking to form a planning committee in July, and then starting in with some online listening sessions in the following couple of months. So that was a lot of talking by me. And so just kind of want to end with this, and we can open this up, and it can be informal. But maybe we just sort of start this off today about hearing what folks think about these ideas, and if they want to share about what they see are kind of around 3 areas: biggest opportunities for UCGIS, greatest challenges, and maybe that one thing that you would really like to see addressed over the next 2, 3, 5 years. Thanks.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, the chat is open, so you can post things there, or if you want to actually just speak, raise your hand and I will enable your permissions there. I think we did have one comment in the chat already, Jeff, from Karen. Says, I like the idea of beginning with the organizational culture that has derailed this kind of planning in the past. Oh, Karen, were you going to add more to that?
Are people able to speak?
If they raise their hand, I can click the button that allows them to do that. So
I would like to hear that from Karen, actually, how this derailed this type of planning in the past, if she's up for it.
all right, Karen, you should be good. I think you'll have to unmute yourself there.
That
There
working? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Karen.
Super cool. All right. I'm delighted. Thank you, Harv and Jeff, for taking this on. It was on my to-do agenda in our first COVID year, and fell apart, of course, as everything else did. And I see Jeff, you found the folders that I found and was working my way through. I might have a few more, so let me look in my stuff and see if I can find any bits that went astray for you. And of course, there's a zillion things I could say, but I'm trying to be quiet. I really like the organizational culture starting point, though. That's a really good piece, because looking at the old model you had, that's the one we were beginning to think about. And it was so clumsy for us to start with those, whatever the things were at the top of the list, because we didn't even know all this other stuff yet. So I think really digging into the organizational culture and trying to articulate that so that it drives the conversation, that might clear up any kind of things that come along when you get a good idea and then it gets killed because somebody says, well, we can't do that because we have membership model or whatever. So I think that's a great idea. I strongly support that. So rah, go ahead.
Thank you.
Others, what do you think is the biggest opportunity? Karen, your hand's up again?
No.
Oh.
We saw it go up.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Oh, Karen and I are playing tag with her hand thing. There we go. All right. All good. Okay. Yeah. Feel free to either raise your hand or post a question in the chat. Jochen brings us a question. Says, who are we? Who do we want to be? Who do we want to represent? We moved from NCGIA to UCGIS to spread GI science across academia, but the emphasis was clearly on R1 institutions and aspirants. Many of these have since turned their back on UCGIS. How do we become a 500-member organization, and do we want to? That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, do we want to? That's a really good question. How big do we want to be?
Well, and I think, how do we define 500 members? Are we talking about 500 institutions? Are we talking about 500 fully engaged people? I mean, we have over 1,000 people in our member database right now, but as we know, not all of them are active.
And I kind of agree with what Joken's saying here about I think we need to move beyond our R1 original focus and think about how do we build up teaching? How do we build up GIS infrastructure on campus? If you remember when I gave my, I guess what would be a campaign speech in Syracuse, I said my vision for the UCGIS in the future would be how do we make campuses better GIS campuses? And there's a lot to unpack in that because I do think, as I said during the slideshow, I really don't think universities there are exceptions, but many universities still struggle or frankly don't support GIS infrastructure in campus.
Right. Yeah, I think we see that at other organizational meetings where you'll have one or two key folks that are deeply engaged in the work, and then they're constantly struggling with IT and with administration and whatever else to move forward with that. And then we have other campuses that have these very holistic things. Let's see, we have another in the chat. Young May says this is related to the membership status and the different categories that the board and executive audit officers worked on recently, including the bylaws revision. Yes, and we have more bylaws revision to come because the bylaws are a big heavy lift, and the task force last year under Shillong's leadership got through a huge chunk of it, but there's a lot more to do. And so as we think about next steps, as Jeff propels us through this strategic planning process, there will probably be corresponding changes to the bylaws. Let's see, Jeremy, let me enable you there. Go ahead.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thanks so much for doing this, and really appreciate your efforts, and thank you. So one thing you mentioned, Harvey, at some point, I think, was engaging with other organizations. And I don't know, for me, that's one of the biggest opportunities that UCGIS has in terms of engaging with other academic organizations, engaging with other industry partners and so on. And I was just wondering, I don't know if that could be a point of conversation, if you could speculate, any one of you or anyone else could speculate a little bit on how UCGIS might advance that and what might be the advantages of doing that for us.
I think we've had an element of that in our culture already. I mean, the fact that we have workforce development panels and we try to interface with industry. I also think that our recent move towards expanding towards being more welcoming, I should say, the community colleges, I think is a good step forward. So I would agree. The UCGIS represents something. Like for example, there's a discussion going on right now about federal spatial data infrastructure, and we were approached as the UCGIS to send a representative, and to I think Dudley's going to that one, I think, yes, and to basically represent the scientific academic view of GIS on this discussion about building federal spatial data infrastructure. So I think we have the visibility. I think people think of us as a go-to organization. I just think we need to be a little more intentional about these relationships and not just be opportunistic. Not that being opportunistic is a bad idea, but in thinking about the strategic planning exercise, we really need to think intentionally about who are the organizations that we want to interface with. But I believe, representing universities which have multifaceted GIS missions, that's how we should be. It should involve research, should involve teaching, should involve workforce development, government, service, things like that. What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, I agree with everything Harvey shared, and I think too, to sort of thinking about, the relationship with other organizations, what sorts of things do they have that complement things that we have, right? We have the body of knowledge, which is there for everybody, but it's our thing at this point, that we're able to provide to the community. For example, we don't have a journal like some professional organizations do. And others do. So like CAGIS has a journal, for example. We've talked about that over the years, and it hasn't been a thing. And so I think thinking about ways that, where alignments with other organizations, benefit all of the parties in those alignments, is kind of the way to approach this, I guess, in my mind. I don't know, Jeremy, if you have other thoughts on that.
No, I appreciate that. Those are great ideas. And, I know obviously UCGIS has a lot of relationships with other organizations and has in the past and has had a lot of really valuable initiatives. But yeah, I like the idea of, it being, maybe more intentional in building those out. It's just in my experience, it takes, some foresight and commitment to move forward, building a relationship that lasts, that's not dependent on, say, one individual person or something like that. So, and, maybe they'll be there and maybe they're not. So, anyway, just some thoughts, but I really like the idea of sort of expanding the scope of what UCGIS can do, given it's a small organization with mostly volunteers, and, leveraging relationships with other interested organizations. And I would also extend that to other, industry partners might be, a way for UCGIS to, move forward strategically. So happy to help contribute and think this through if you're interested. So thank you.
Sounds like a member of our planning committee, Jeff.
Yep.
Mhm. I heard him volunteering.
I have his mobile number. I'll put him on speed dial now.
Let me ask people. Oh no, that was an existing. Let me ask people just a kind of a food for thought question. When you hear UCGIS, what do you think? Put a word in the chat or two words or something. What the first thing that pops in your head when you think about this organization? What's your image of it? I'm disturbed that people have no image of our organization so far. It's a tough one. It's a tough question. Awesome GI science community. Thank you, Song. You laugh at that, and you put a little smiley face there, but I actually agree with that. One of the things I love about this organization is it's such a good community. It feels like people really want to come together and recognize, support, and celebrate GI science at universities. And that's what attracted me when I was nominated to be president. I thought this is a great community. I'd like to really kind of ramp up my involvement in it. But a community needs a mission. I think that's what we're kind of struggling with, not struggling with, but thinking about right now. But Song, I agree with you completely. We have a great community. Let's get them to do something. That sounded a little harsh. That's not what I meant. I just meant let's think about what the community should do in the future.
I think
Anyone?
Revisited the mission statement a few times, and I can't remember when the most recent revision was, but I think the mission statement speaks pretty well to where we want to go. But making it actionable. Jeff talked a lot about the culture and connecting the strategic plan to the things that we actually want to do. And I think that's really, yeah, theory to application. Absolutely. So we have this mission, we have this vision, and maybe the vision gets a little retooled, but I think that the mission statement is pretty well where we've settled as an organization. But how do we push that forward and really leverage it? Let's see. Yangmei says one special thing about UCGS, maybe it's institution membership. One member means a group of people. Absolutely. In the meantime, an interested individual may be limited in participating in UCGS activities unless there's institutional support. Yeah, absolutely. We've run against that a few times where we've got one individual at an institution who really wants to join, but lacks the departmental or university level support to do that. And I think that's always going to be a sticking point for us, where which model makes more sense, right? We've run financial analyses and things like that, and at the moment the model that we're in is a pretty solid one. Where we do run into trouble, and Harvey mentioned this earlier, is we do have institutions where we have no depth in the bench, right? We have one or two folks that are fully engaged with UCGIS and nobody else, and so when they retire or move on or what have you, then we kind of have to start over rebuilding the relationship at that institution. And so I think we want to, as a group of invested, engaged people, we want to encourage all of our peers to, invite their new colleagues to join, or if we cultivate more grad student relationships as they go out and enter the workforce, they will hopefully stay engaged with us in ways like that. We've seen that happen quite a bit over the last few years. A lot of really engaged grad students have gone on to get faculty and research positions and stayed connected to the organization. So I think that's really helpful. That's been a big push of mine since I've been here, is to get greater depth at each one of our member institutions.
I know, like Harvey's talked about, how we don't have a true conference, right? And that maybe there's a gap that could be filled there in terms of, an applied conference or something like that. And so one of the ways that we're addressing that now is like through this partnership with UCGIS in a way, right? But that is a way to sort of build that community where you're creating opportunities for people to come together, even if maybe they're not our delegate or they're, a one person at an institution kind of a thing. And so to think about what that looks like moving forward, but also in recognition of, there's a carbon footprint to a conference too.
And I think there's no question that we need to gather. Things happen when people gather that don't happen when we're doing things online. On the other hand, we just have to think about, like, how do we spend a carbon budget carefully in trying to accommodate, trying to create a community and facilitate a community.
Yeah.
But I have said that in the past. People have heard this from me, that we kind of missed the boat in not developing a research conference, especially one that's geared towards applied GIS. I think there's a lot of people on campuses who are doing GIS, but they're not in the GIS community, and they may go to a public health conference or an engineering conference or a sociology or whatever. They may go to these conferences and not have a place to talk about their GIS work. So I've been really happy with our partnership with UCGIS this year. It's actually working out very well so far. Check with me again on June 7th, I guess. But I think it's worked out really well so far. And this may be some model that we go forward with. We already signed a MOU for this year, and this is something we could talk about expanding to multiple years. But it does help solve that gap, I think, that exists. We used to have those conferences. Remember GIS LAS, for those of you who are old enough? Jeff's old enough to remember that.
Yeah.
There's also ERISA. That's another organization that kind of is geared towards applied GIS, at least within urban.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've got, if you haven't looked at the schedule much this for this year's symposium, I think we've got some appeal to both crowds, because we've got sort of a research papers track and then a panels and discussions track, which lets us kind of leverage the best of both worlds there. We've got the more academic focus paper tracks, and then we've got the the panels where we often get to pull in industry folks and other practitioners that might not be doing what we would consider to be academic research.
Mhm.
And I've enjoyed those discussions at the UC. That's some of the high points of the UCGIS conferences I've gone to in the past. Those fantastic panels and forums.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean,
Eric.
that's kind of a competitive advantage that we do have in some cases, because we're not just another academic paper conference, right? There's more of that kind of engaged discussion. Let's see. Eric says, I would advocate for a better phrase than applied GIS if we plan to reach out to a broader community. It's not positive. I would agree. There's an applied geography conference that happens every fall that I went to for a number of years. And I think that that term is almost limiting.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
we'll probably have to wordsmith that a little bit, but
The Applied Geography Conference now is called AGX, I think they call it for
I'm
short.
not sure that's any better.
Let me ask the second question about greatest challenges. And I think we recognize one challenge is that we're a resource limited organization that relies upon a lot of volunteer work. But let me turn that a little bit, twist it a bit, and say, what would you say is the greatest challenge to GI science on your campus? I mean, I'll mention mine. I think that there's just a lack of GIS support infrastructure here. We have to do it on our own. And also, I think there's a lot of people. We have a list of 70 people supposedly at OSU, faculty and researchers who claim to be geospatial people, which is the proper inclusive term here at OSU. But it's very fragmented. There's not really a community like that on campus. Everyone's off doing their own thing. We don't have the synergy. Is that the same at other campuses? Would people agree, or do you have other challenges you'd like to, besides the usual challenges facing campuses right now?
I wonder if that's an opportunity for a future webinar or panel session at a conference is to kind of talk about these different models. Because I know on my campus, the model that we have when we go to the Esri user conference, we share that with tons of people at the education conference because they're like, oh, that works really well. Let's talk about it. Let's see. Jeremy says GIS is often very siloed. Yeah, not everyone doing GIS identifies with GI science, right? Makes it a bit difficult to build community. Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why I'm thinking maybe one of these conversations where we talk about how to build a GIS community on your campus, and have people talk about different models that are working that they've tried. That could be maybe very informative.
Hey, Jeff, you sent that to the hosts only, but
Oh, sorry.
Jeff, yeah, Jeff said GIS becoming geospatial data science for better or for worse. Yeah, like I said, that's the acceptable term on my campus. If you say GIS, they say you're a geographer, but if you say geospatial, they're like, let's see. Go ahead. You want to go ahead and read, Amy?
Sure, yeah. So Shilong says there are many meaningful tasks for UCGIS to pursue, correct? Yeah, maybe too many. But each task needs people, volunteers to act on it. UCGIS needs to engage people beyond the delegates and board members, such as graduate, undergraduate students, industry partners, to make things happen. Yeah, absolutely. And then Eric says, we're fortunate to have USpatial in Minnesota. Minnesota has pushed spatial as the rally cry rather than GIS, which I think helps with inclusion beyond just GI science folks. Yeah, I agree. I think USpatial is probably one of those case studies we'd want to include in a conversation about how to develop some of that community.
Yeah, I have a copy of that book and I've read through it, and it's impressive, the model at University of Minnesota.
Yeah.
It's something we should look at carefully.
We have, Cal Poly Humboldt is obviously a much smaller institution, but we have a couple of partnerships that we've developed. So we have a geospatial faculty where we reach out to everybody who's teaching courses GIS related, and then we have a geospatial IT working group where the I would say the most heavily invested faculty and researchers using it meet with key personnel in IT a couple of times a semester to work out any issues. then we have a steering committee because we're multi-departmental. So we've got this sort of multiple moving parts model that's been working really well for us. And like I said, I think it would be just really nice to kind of maybe showcase some of these things that work well at certain campuses for other campuses that want to get there. Obviously, we can't go to your campus and say, do it this way, but if you have a campus and a collective group of individuals that are motivated to create something like that, it would be nice to be able to showcase some examples for them.
Mhm.
Only got a few minutes left. What is the one thing you'd like to see addressed? I'd like to see someone leave us several million dollars in their will. That would really help us.
Mhm.
Any,
Sure would. We'd do a lot with $7 million.
anyone doing estate planning out there? Don't forget the UCGIS. It is an issue. I joke, but our thin resources are an issue. We really, to be honest, I feel like as president, I'm doing a lot more nuts and bolts stuff than I thought I would be doing. I thought I'd be working mostly at the strategic level, but I'm down there in the machinery with Amy
Mhm.
every week working on the symposium and other things,
For
which is
sure.
actually in some ways it's good. I like to kind of get my hands on things, but on the other hand, I feel like it kind of takes away time for my ability to think strategically and build strategic plans and relationships for the organization.
Right. One of the things I think that maybe we don't leverage enough is that as a nonprofit organization, when we have our member institutions putting together grants and they need a nonprofit partner to leverage, we might be that partner. That might be a good fit.
Yeah.
So Maya says we may need to strengthen our research initiatives. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you know, we used to do that a lot in the early days of the UCGIS, the challenges and so forth, and we revisited them, published a book, if I remember correctly. I think I remember correctly because I think I have a co-author of a chapter in it. But that was something we did very carefully and took a lot of our time is thinking about what are the big challenges we face.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, that's one for me too, that I think about, like, should we be setting a research agenda every 5 years? But like Harvey said, it takes a lot of work to do an exercise like that.
Yes.
Yeah, it does. We have a big research committee. It is, I think it's the largest of our committees, in fact. Um, Second only by the education committee. Um, and so, maybe that's something that we float past them and see if they're interested in doing that. But we have other committees, as Sheilong points out, we need volunteers to do everything we have other committees like, Dudley is de facto a committee of one as our external
Mhm.
relations person because the other folks have a lot going on and aren't able to attend as many things as he's been able to attend being close to DC.
Yeah, we
Um,
appreciate him.
yeah, absolutely. We have some other committees that are a little bit smaller as well. And so, we can't put all the eggs in one basket, right? We can't have one committee get all the resources because we need all of them to keep us whole. And so we think about, if we do that where we strengthen our research initiatives, how do we do that without making that draw away from the other committees, or how do we do it in a way that maybe includes the other committees and we do it holistically as an organization?
Mhm.
Um,
Oh,
Patricia
Patricia,
says, I love the Post-it notes from
mhm.
Buffalo so people could freely propose ideas. Yeah, okay. Maybe we can whip out some Post-it notes at this
That
one again.
that's a great idea for the meeting in June.
Karen says, if the manpower could be mobilized, our early efforts on the research agendas were very engaging for the entire community. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's nice to kind of have a focus.
I agree. I kind of miss those conversations and some cases battles. But just my comment on that is that I think in the past our research initiatives have been a little bit too inward looking, and we should be thinking about how GIS can kind of meet grand societal and scientific challenges. And we have a big one, as I mentioned, the climate emergency. I think every organization should be thinking about how they're going to help address that. And if anyone should, it should be people doing GIS and GI science.
Mhm.
Okay, we're out of time. In fact, we're 1 minute over. So I guess I can wrap up, I guess. Thank you
Yeah.
very, very much for your participation in this initial conversation. This will continue. This will continue at the symposium in June, and this will continue beyond the symposium in June. We'll be looking for people to join this effort, both formally, but also provide us feedback and ideas. And yes, we have a great community here, and I'm looking forward to the next 30 years of it with this refreshed strategic mission. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks all.